Hey, everybody. So, we wanted to talk about this big upcoming transit, which is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And we've gotten a little bit of a preview of it this summer. It wasn't exact, it came very, very close, like within minutes, not degrees, but minutes of actually meeting in very, very early Aries. But I'll mention that. Before we actually get to that, though, I just want to highlight some other key transits going on this month in the month of November 2025. So we have Jupiter, which is going retrograde. So kind of like Mercury, but we usually don't notice Jupiter so much. I'd say it's more in the area of like, opportunities, faith, different things like that. When Jupiter goes retrograde, we tend to be a little bit more introspective, less optimistic and confident as far as like, going, sort of like our abundance philosophy of life. Maybe it dries up a little bit. Jupiter also deals with like law, legal matters, sometimes philosophical matters. So it could be a case of which, we're literally reviewing something related in those affairs. But again, it doesn't usually show up like, I mean, I'm not going to say it's not important. It does show up, but we usually in astrology don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. Most astrologers focus on Mercury retrograde and all, but Jupiter is there nevertheless. And so it can represent kind of reevaluating again, like, philosophical approaches, even things like travel. It's sort of like I don't want to call it like a higher octave of Mercury. That's Uranus, but it can show up like you're probably not going to get into like any big problems around travel when Jupiter goes retrograde, but it's just like again, a way of looking at like expansion opportunities, big picture things. So more of a review in those areas. But nevertheless, it is going retrograde in Cancer. It's at 25, or will station at 25 degrees of Cancer in 9 minutes, and it will go backwards up to about 15 degrees, back to about 15 degrees of Cancer over the next several weeks, and then eventually go direct again, in which case it's going to go all the way forward into Aries, or not Aries. Yeah, eventually it'll get to Aries, but Leo is what I meant. I'm just thinking a lot about fire right now. So, so good time for Leos next year. We'll talk about that in the
Yay.
Yay for our Leo rising people, our Leo sun people, and our Leo moon people, though. Mandy, by the way, is two of those. We'll let you figure out which two. You listen to us, you probably already know.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so we have that. The one that we'll notice a little bit more, though, is Saturn going direct. And so Saturn will go direct at stations stations directed 25 degrees of Pisces, 2509. And this is actually key. And I'll go ahead and mention it, even though it doesn't happen until next month. We have Neptune, which is also retrograde right now in Pisces, and it's going to go directed on December 10th, 2025 at 29 degrees of Pisces. So Neptune has been hovering around this critical final degree. And like in the zodiac, 29 degrees of Pisces. So if you don't know, there's 30 degrees in every sign.
Mm.
29th degree of the zodiac, or the 29th degree of any sign in the zodiac is an important degree. It's what we call the anaretic degree. Literally, the energy has no place else to go. It's going to morph into something else. It's going to change, but it's like our runway. So it can't do anything else in the sign, and it's going to move, because it's like something new is coming in. The soul wants to change. The energy wants to change. It's like we got to go somewhere, but we can't continue here. Well, 29 degree of Pisces is the very last degree of the zodiac. And so when we
Mm.
get to 29 degrees of Pisces, it's the actual end of a cycle. Like, so
Mm.
everything going back to the last time Neptune was at this place from the point where it crossed over into zero Aries up until now. That's 165 years. So that's a
Mm.
long, long time. None of us are gonna, I mean, as much as I love cycles and like I'd love to see a Neptune return, I'm not going to see it. Mandy, I don't think you're going to see one either, though. But it would be
Yeah.
curious to experience one. But countries do experience Neptune returns. And so historically, the United States has had one Neptune return at this point. I mean, it actually happened in the, I think, 1940s, actually during World War II, which is interesting to note.
Mm.
But the last time it was at this point where it's coming up on 0 degrees of Aries, where, it crossed over into Aries earlier this year, hovered around that point with Saturn. got really, really close to this conjunction aspect, but didn't quite get there. It's close. So we're still in the old cycle. We haven't crossed over into the new point. But if you saw our other videos, which, will be videos when we publish this, we'll divide this up. But this was like, we talked about the cycles. We talked about, spring, the summer, the fall, the winter. So we're in late, 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 very, very late winter as the cycle goes. And actually, we kind of like dipped our toe into spring when Neptune crossed over into Aries and when Saturn did that. But now we're back in winter. Kind of, so it's like a review. We're going back over sort of this
Mhm.
energy. And in a sense, because the 29th degree is really the culmination of Pisces and the whole zodiac, it's almost like a review of like everything that happened over the last, not only the last past decade. Neptune has been in Pisces since 2011. That's when it first crossed over, and it's been in Pisces for a while. Neptune stays in for about 15, 16 years in any given sign. Saturn stays in for about 2.5. But this period that we're in is both a review of like the last past 14, 15, 16 years, going back to 2011. It's also a review of the past 165 years, going back to where it was, when it was last in Aries around this point. Last time Neptune was in Aries, we had the Civil War. So like that
Mhm.
was a like obviously big big deal in the United States at that point in time. The country literally split into two, the Confederacy and the Union, which, ultimately the Union won, but it was a very tumultuous time to say the least for the country. Not only because of Neptune, or not even necessarily because of Neptune, but it was, there are things in the United States founding chart which we can go into at some point, and we will, which we'll talk about that and see why, that was such a big deal at that point in time. But I say all that to say that, it is significant that Neptune's at 29 degrees and Saturn is back at 25 degrees of Pisces. And, these are culmination degrees, like really the last 5 or so degrees of the sign leading up to the very end of it. And so this is a time of review, and it's also a time of like, nothing new has really started per se. Like, yes, things are starting all the time, but also like we're really at this phase of like, if it's felt like to you for the past year or so that like nothing new is happening, that there's almost this kind of like I give up energy. Like, I mean, we might see it in politics, we might see it in our lives, we might see it in our relationships. It's just kind of like this dead, moving, surrender, I give up kind of energy. That is like late Pisces to a T. Again, Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac, and on the soul's journey of the zodiac, it's like the last. Pisces is the last stop before you like dissolve back into like the universe, God, the great beyond, literally in the
Mhm.
soul's journey, or before we start over again, reincarnating again in the Aries and starting a brand new, fresh cycle. So,
Mhm.
it is the culmination, but it is going to be a new beginning too. It is the end. It is the end of winter, the very, very end of winter. And just like we've been talking about in the series that Mandy and I have been doing here, that, we started off earlier episodes or earlier versions of this video in which we talked about spring, the new moon basically being the beginning of spring. Full moon
Mhm.
is basically fall harvest time. It's time to harvest all the plants, all the seeds that have grown up in the crops, time to get the corn, time to file it away for the winter, which is coming. And then we have the spring, which is the renewal of it again. Everything begins anew. So
Mhm.
what we're seeing when these two planets, when Saturn and Neptune meet again, it's essentially the new moon of Saturn and Neptune, just like the sun and moon meeting together, Mandy. It's going to be the new moon of these powerful two planets. Saturn, which represents structure, which represents responsibility, which really
Mhm.
represents, like the foundations, our underpinnings, the commitments, our values and integrity. Saturn is, really represents so much of that.
Mhm.
Neptune is sort of this, it's a very mysterious planet, and like a lot of us struggle to understand it, but Saturn really is sort of it's kind of this essence of spirit itself, of non-reality, or let's say the non-material reality of things. Though Saturn is like the essence, the core of like the material. Neptune is the non-material, and so
Mhm.
these two meeting. are really going to challenge our fundamental understandings of reality itself. We're going to see a redefining of that. We're going to see a new
Mm.
beginning, a brand new, a fresh new cycle that starts. And it all starts on February 20th, 2026 at 11:54 a.m. That's where they meet for the one and only time they're going to meet this time around at 0 degrees of Aries in 45 minutes. So it's a powerful new beginning. And as powerful as the 29th degree of Pisces is, 0 degrees of Aries is even more powerful because it literally is the first
Yeah.
possible place you can plant the seed for a new
Yeah.
beginning. It's spring. So it's a brand new season for the cycle. So reality phase shift, powerful new energy coming in, powerful new beginnings. We've been waiting for this for a while, and I think we're going to see some really, really interesting things happening going into the new year.
Yeah. Hmm. Like, which will they be? We'll
Yeah,
have to
I could
wait and
put in
see.
an edit here, so we'll put
Yeah.
in an edit here. So one thing I want to add is that there's one country in particular, and I'm sure there's others, but as a former history teacher, well, I mean, always a history teacher, right? Like I didn't stop just because I left the classroom, Andy, but
Mhm.
we see this in Russia. And so there is this cycle,
Mhm.
the Saturn-Neptune cycle in Russia really, really shows up powerfully. And so, like honestly, if I were knowing this and knowing the history of this, like, I don't know if Vladimir Putin has an astrologer, but like, I mean, if he does, like, I think that person should probably be speaking up, but then they might be worried about losing their head. But I mean, but seriously, so this
Yeah.
cycle is not, I guess it's a matter of perspective, but I would say it's generally not been kind to whoever's in charge in Russia
Uh,
because we can go back to the last time they met, last time Saturn and Neptune met, which was on November 13th, 1989. And we all know what happened around that time. If you were alive or if you look back in history though, that was basically around that time was the collapse of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the whole Eastern Bloc. The Second World is, which is a term we don't even use anymore because it doesn't exist. But the whole Iron Curtain communist bloc of countries, that existed, that Russia, Soviet Union set up as a buffer between itself and Western Europe and, the capitalist free world, right? So that
mhm.
collapsed soon after, Russia itself or the Soviet Union collapsed. There was that coup, that and eventually, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the president of the Soviet Union, was, basically put out of power and, the Soviet Union dissolved. So that was obviously massive, massive change at that point in time. So that was the previous Saturn Neptune conjunction. Before that, which happened in the early 1950s, so only a few years after World War II, Joseph Stalin was, of course, the leader of the Soviet Union at that point in time, and he led Soviet Union through, all of its tribulations and everything during World War II, as they were fighting off the Nazis. And, at that point in time, the Soviet Union was one of the allies, during World War II with Great Britain, with France, the resistance in the United States. Right. But he was still an evil, evil, evil guy, like a dictator if there ever was one. Well,
Mhm.
he dies in the 1950s at this conjunction that happens and at this time. So, this great dictator falls. He dies really, but it's not like it was a violent fall, but he's gone. Nikita Khrushchev, who became the new leader, took over, and he goes about things in a lot more modern diplomatic way than Stalin did. So it was I think it was a positive change. Didn't end the Cold War or anything like that. In some ways, it actually just escalated. But but Stalin was gone, so leadership changed. Prior to this, it was I think 1917 or whatever when the previous conjunction before the one in the 1950s happened. Bolshevik Revolution. So this was literally the fall of the. I know, right? You're laughing, Mandy, but yeah,
Why
fall
Russia though? Like obviously it's not like this is hanging over the Russian like country, but why or this is just like it just happens this way like in
It's
history.
closely tied in, I believe, with their chart. Well, we need to pull it up and look
Oh,
at it. And I'm not like intimately familiar with the Russian founding chart, whatever the, whatever chart we would go by for modern Russia. Obviously, there are several because when the Soviet Union collapsed, a new Russian Republic was
Right.
founded. And so, but I
Nobody
believe
true.
there's some base chart somewhere, like, whatever, the kingdom nation of Russia began is, it probably shows up well in that. And I'd say it's probably associated with some aspect of power, something in the Soviet Union or something in Russia's chart. It might actually be a Saturn-Neptune conjunction itself, that may show up in that chart. So we'll have to pull it up and look at it at some point in time. But very,
Mm.
very powerful. And so that's why I say, like in all honesty, like Putin should be, I would, if I were Vladimir Putin, I think I would be heading for the hills right now. I'm not saying anything like, I mean, we're not saying anything's
Yeah.
going to happen, but I'm just like looking at the historical patterns, like something's up in 2026 over there. So
Yeah.
just
Wow.
FYI, no predictions, not saying anything's going to happen, not saying he has anything to worry about. But if I look at the astrology patterns here, I'd say
Bring the
odds are
umbrella.
something's going to go down. Something is definitely going to go down for Russia. While we're on
Wow.
the subject, though, I want to say about the United States. I mean, we are in this energy too, not with the Saturn Neptune conjunction so much, though. Like it will be important. It will be a big deal. We are going to see, I think, the founding of, some new structures. I think, when Saturn and Neptune meet up, we usually see the collapse of old structures and we see, a new reality being born. We obviously have a lot going on with technology. AI is everywhere and taking off. It may be a big tech bubble. Maybe it actually busts at
Mm.
some point and causes a lot of turmoil or whatever. But I think we are going to see, we'll definitely see some challenging developments going into 2026, which we will talk about, in the coming weeks and months. But also I think we'll see some positive new developments too. And hey, anytime you have something in Aries, something new is going to get
Gonna
started.
happen,
So
yeah.
maybe new social movements. I honestly think we're at a point in the United States where our old system is crumbling too.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, clearly, like there is a need,
Lots of ways.
and this isn't like a political statement, but, Mandy, I know we're both on the same page with this. So I'll just say, like, I don't, the history guy in me and the guy that's kind of a recovering political scientist says that, like, I just don't see how we can keep going with a
Mhm.
gerrymandered system with these two parties that are so extreme and like you can't
Yeah.
keep doing this as a country and expect to survive. So we've got to reach a breaking and resolution point. And it's
Yeah.
coming. It's definitely coming. And we'll start to see that I think really unfold, as the year goes on. But the key for that, just as the Saturn Neptune conjunction is key for the Soviet Union, the Uranus return to the United States is just as
Um,
important. So, United States, based upon the July 4th, 1776 founding, we use the Sibley chart. I know there's several other charts that, are in use regarding the founding of the United States. Some people say it was July 2nd. Some people
mhm.
actually use the ratification of the Constitution itself, in the 1780s as the founding. There's a lot of different charts out for like when America was officially founded. I mean, some people even go back as far as like 1620,
Mm.
ending at Plymouth Rock. But
Yeah.
for our purposes, let's do the 1776 chart. And so in that Uranus, which nobody knew existed at that point in time,
Mhm.
that didn't come about for a few more years. But Uranus was at 8 degrees and about 55 minutes of Gemini. And so
Mm.
we see this show up again and again. Very, very powerful placement. There have been powerful aspects over the past, since the founding of the United States, including another cycle that I'll talk about, and we'll get into all these at some point. But the Neptune Pluto conjunction, like, so I'm talking about Saturn Neptune. Neptune Pluto is like civilizational. That was like in 1891, 1892. That was huge, but that was around 8, 9 degrees of Gemini. So when you hear people talk about the American century, like there's a reason for that and why so much technology exploded around that point in time. Neptune and Pluto met at 8 degrees, 9 degrees of Gemini. And so I
Mm,
think Gemini deals a lot with communication. And
mm,
like you go back to that time, I mean, we had like, Alexander Graham Bell, the, founding around that time, a little bit earlier, but like the technology was being born, for the telegraph, eventually telecommunications and all. But this was just like the prime, this was like the lightning strike that like hit America and like led to this big, massive explosion of, our technology, a lot around communications. We're
mhm,
going to see some of that accelerate again because Uranus is coming back to that point. But not only are we going to see a technological explosion, we have to follow that. This is actually the third time this has happened since the country
mhm,
it was founded. First time we had what we call our Uranus return, which is when it returns to that point where it was founded, was 1861. And we all know that time if you study history, because that was, of course, the Civil War. And, I think South Carolina being the first state to secede from the Union right around that time. So that was huge. And
mhm.
then, obviously we fought the Civil War, eventually stitched the country back together more or less. 84 years later, World War II. It was around the
Mm.
time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor when the
Mm.
United States got involved. Yeah. So heavy,
Wars,
heavy
wars on
things.
wars.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I know, and a lot of astrologers are talking about that. We're like, are we going to get into a war? I don't know. I would hazard to guess that we might not, but looking at our politics right now, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I don't want to go on record as predicting anything. The one
Yeah,
thing I will say is that, certainly it's going to be looking at the scale of those events. Like, I mean, Civil War and World War II, two of the most significant wars in this country's history. It's going to be something on that scale. If it's not a war, it's going to be something that's going to probably fundamentally alter the foundations, if not the trajectory of this country, for
yeah,
better, for worse. Hopefully for better. I mean, I think that's what we
for
can
better.
certainly hope for, but, that's coming up too. So we'll have more about that in the coming weeks and months. But, I think a good way to finish off this session here is as we started off, I think with that Chinese proverb that I used, may you live in interesting times. And I say
Hmm.
that to you, Mandy, and myself, and to all of us. May you live in interesting times because it sure feels like we're in them.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
one way to describe
Cat
it.
believes so too.
The cat lives in it's every day's an interesting time for her.
Yeah.
It's whatever her prerogative is.
Yeah. No, cats live in their own world, but
I
or
know.
maybe we live in maybe we
We
live
live
in
in
theirs.
theirs.
Yeah. Yeah.
We just live in theirs.
Yeah. Thank you for watching. Please click subscribe below and follow us. Welcome to our community.